Hello. We continue our discussion on program planning. In this video, I want to talk about the third stage in program planning, which is determining the intervention that we're going to use. We've already completed the understanding the problem stage that has two steps: defining the problem and its problem model, conducting a needs assessment. We've also identified clear goal and outcome objectives for our program. Now that we know what the problem is and what we want to accomplish, it's time to look for the how we're going to accomplish those objectives. And that is through an intervention. Intervention is the act of intervening, interfering, or interceding with the intent of modifying an outcome. Right? It's an activity conducted with a group or an individual in order to change an existing condition or behavior. Right? So we have the problem. We know where we want to get. We need to make a change, right? That's the reason to be for the program. So the intervention is what's going to cause that change in the outcome. So the intervention really is the set of activities that we're going to implement in order to achieve our outcome. Now, how do we choose an intervention, right? Of course, the goal is to choose the intervention that is most effective and efficient, that will help us achieve the goals and objectives of our program. But how do we choose between interventions? How do we choose between interventions? How do we choose which one is best, right? And you may say, well, we should choose the intervention that is proven to be effective, the one that is most effective. Okay, that is proven. But how do we assess that proof? After all, anybody who has created an intervention, they will swear that their intervention is the best. So how do we go about sorting out these interventions in terms of which one is most effective, and how and how valid the proof they have is? Well, that's why I want to talk about evidence-based interventions, right? To avoid the problem of everybody claiming to have the best intervention, or with sometimes suspicious proofs, right? Many organizations, mostly those that fund programs, like the government or big foundations, they have designed classification systems, right, that can judge the evidence of interventions in terms of their capacity to achieve the outcomes they claim to achieve. These organizations are called evidence-based clearinghouses. Their job is to study the evidence of each intervention and give a final judgment on whether there is evidence or sufficient evidence that shows that the intervention works or not. Now, the intervention for which a clearinghouse has found sufficient positive evidence of their effectiveness, they're given a status of evidence-based practice. Right? So organizations have come together to create these clearinghouses that are scientific arms of their organizations that study all the interventions out there, and they determine which ones have enough evidence supporting those interventions, and they give them a status of evidence-based practices. We should always look for an evidence-based practice. But which interventions are evidence-based? How do these clearinghouses determine which ones are which proof is sufficient, or what kind of proof is sufficient, or which interventions are better than others? Well, evidence-based, like I said, is a classification for interventions that have been shown through scientific study to produce consistently positive results. Now, evidence-based status is determined by a process in which experts, using commonly agreed upon criteria for rating interventions, come to a consensus that evaluation research findings are credible and can be substantiated. In other words, when there is a strong evidence of a cause and effect relationship, right? That the program has caused, or that this intervention has caused or strongly contributed to the desired outcomes. So, in a clearinghouse, experts are looking for evidence that an intervention causes a desired outcome. And the key word here is causes, right? They have to be sure that it is the intervention that is causing the outcome and not some other factor, or is not just a natural growth, or is not just a change that we observe by chance. We have to be sure that it was the intervention that causes the outcome. Now, what does it mean for an intervention to cause an outcome? Well, there is a criteria to establish causality, and we will go over this criteria in detail when we get to the evaluation portion of the course. But for the purposes of this class, I want you to understand that in order to have proof that an intervention causes some outcome, it has to be established that there was a statistical relationship between the intervention and the change or the outcome, and that the change came after the intervention was put, and that there is no other variable that may explain this change. Also, a scientific peer review process has to be in place that has reviewed the study, and that this study has been replicated with different samples. Now, how do they do this? How do evaluators, or how do scientists prove that an intervention caused some outcome? Well, like in any lab, causality is best determined by a randomized controlled trial, right? So a randomized controlled trial is an experimental design. Now, let me explain with an example. Suppose we want to test if a reading intervention has a positive effect on third grade reading proficiency, as measured by standardized test scores. How do we prove that? Well, the gold standard, the best way to prove that would be to run a randomized controlled trial. A randomized controlled trial is a research design where we have an outcome measure, in this case, standardized test scores, and an intervention, in this case, this reading intervention, a treatment group and a control group, where the treatment group will get the intervention and the control group will not, a pre-test and a post-test of each group on this outcome measure. That means we would test the reading proficiency before the intervention and the reading proficiency after the intervention on both groups. And here is the key. The fourth characteristic of a randomized controlled trial is random assignment of participants into treatment and control groups. So how do you run this? Well, in step one, you have all the participants that will go into this experiment. Well, then you randomly assign these participants into a treatment group or a control group. The treatment group is the one that is going to get this reading intervention. The control group, it will be business as usual for them. Now, participants in both groups are tested in their reading, right? They're tested on the outcome measure. Then the treatment group is given the intervention, in this case, the reading intervention or the reading activities. And then after the activities are completed, participants in both groups are tested again. Now, in the last stage of an experimental design, these changes in the outcome from pre to post are compared between groups, the treatment and the control group. If there is a difference between the treatment and the control group, and it's a positive difference, in other words, the treatment group had a better outcome than the control group, this difference is called the treatment effect. And it's attributed to the intervention. It cannot be attributed to any other variables or any other characteristics of the participants, because it was a random assignment into groups. So that's how an experiment is conducted, or a randomized controlled trial is conducted, to prove if an intervention has an impact on an outcome. But again, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard when determining if an implementation or if a treatment caused a certain outcome. Now, is conducting one experiment enough? Well, no, it's not enough. It's an important step, but it's not enough to consider an intervention evidence-based, because not only do you have to conduct the experiment, you also have to have those results reviewed by other scientists, and not only reviewed, but they have to be published in a scientific journal. And not only that they have to be published, right, and reviewed, but sometimes evidence-based clearinghouses would require these experiments to be replicated with different populations in order to say, yes, there is evidence not only from one study, but from different ones. So, in summary, for a practice or for an intervention to become evidence-based, to receive that status, to be given that status by a clearinghouse, they have to be evaluated using a randomized controlled trial design. And the studies need to be replicated. There has to be more than one with different samples, preferably in different places and with different scientists. And all these studies need to be reviewed by other scientists, and they need to be published in the scientific literature. If an intervention has all those, they will receive evidence-based status because there's sufficient proof that they work. If an intervention does not have evidence-based status, it means that it has probably not been evaluated using a randomized control design, or maybe it just has been evaluated by one, or that the results have not been published. So one of these three things usually is missing if they are not given evidence-based status. Now, it takes a long time for interventions to get evidence-based status, right? It takes years for them to be implemented and then evaluated several times, and they have to be implemented in different settings. So many practices out there probably work, but they have not been rigorously evaluated yet. They're probably new. And there is a place for them. And they're emerging or promising practices. They receive that status, but they don't get this evidence-based status that many funders look for in interventions. Now, it's always better to choose evidence-based programs because we know that they work, that they've been proven to work. And also, if you're a funder, you want to spend your money and resources on programs that have shown to work. Now, in the next video, we will talk about these clearinghouses, where they are, what they are, and how to look for interventions in them. I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.